Make there my tomb beneath the lime tree's shade, where grass and flowers in wild luxuriance wave. Let no memorial mark where I am laid, or point to common eyes the lover's grave. But oft at twilight morn of closing day, the fateful friends with faltering steps shall glide, tributes of fond regrets by stealth to pay, and sigh o'er the unhappy suicide. And sometimes, when the sun with parting rays gild the long grass that hides my silent bed, the tears shall tremble in my Charlotte's eyes. Dear, precious drops, they shall embalm the dead. Yes, Charlotte over the mournful spot shall weep, where her poor Werther and his sorrows sleep. Today, we contemplate a dilemma of admiration, art, and the manner that it can be misused or misrepresented. Or, less eloquently put, are fandoms bad?
Yeah, real spicy take there, Henry.
Yes, with everything going on in the world right now, it might seem a little bit silly to think about the strange and bad behavior that fans might partake in because of a certain fanbase. And to be honest, if the biggest problem you have right now involves a piece of media or a person not meeting your subjective expectations, you're probably doing pretty good for yourself. But it would be a disservice to my profession as an educator and a media creator to deny the real impact and importance that fans have on the way we view the world. After all, a majority of our perceptions within the world are filtered through the lens of media in some form, be it from the books, movies, and games that we might enjoy, the personalities we might follow on the internet, to even the news companies that relay the information that will impact how we live our everyday lives. And in one way or another, fandoms will play at least some part in how we perceive and interact with all of these different types of media. So, for the purposes of better informing people about fandom psychology, and to flex my English degree to be honest, I'm going to tell you the story of the first fandom drama. Now, when you think of the idea of the first fandom, most people tend to think of a couple of things. Most will point out to Star Trek and how it brought fanzines and conventions to public prominence. Others might look to Sherlock Holmes, and the ways that fans practically bullied Sir Arthur Conan Doyle into bringing the character back to life after he seemingly died. And a couple of you cool kids might point to figures like Lord Byron, whose melodramatic cult of personality and poetry practically made him a proto-influencer. Each of these examples can be easily discussed on their own. But as some of you guys might have already picked up, the fandom that we are going to be discussing today came and went before all of these different examples, and went on to influence each of them in their own ways. But before we can get to any of that, we must first discuss the environment that this work first emerged in. This is going to get a little bit buck wild, so stay with me. If you were living in Europe during the late 18th century, a lot of things were changing pretty quickly. Between the public rejections of monarchy within the colonies, news of new worlds being discovered below the equator, and the rising prominence of factories turning your countryside into what must have seemed like a living hellscape at the time, there was a lot to make one concerned. And many people would look towards the emerging sciences and technologies to inform their new perceptions of the world, basing their philosophies on observation rather than more spiritual beliefs. This would be a period later known as the Enlightenment, and the purveyors of these ideas would be known as the skeptics. And unlike a lot of the skeptics we see today, there were a lot of great developments that came from these types of thinkers, as they went on to influence the formations of modern democracies, ethics, and the foundational principles of modern chemistry, physics, biology, and many other fields of science. And that was all well and good. But amongst these Enlightenment thinkers, there were a couple of people that were seeing these developments and, shall we say, had concerns. Dear God, Constance! That Rousseau is saying that the government's authority lies within the consent of the governed, rather than the divine right of the monarchy. The entitlement of these rationals. And don't get me wrong, a lot of that rejection came from that sort of thinking. But there was another sect of thinkers that saw elements of rationalism as constraining. After all, even if we're able to quantify and catalog stuff like plants and elements, there were still going to be things like emotions and art that we can't easily quantify and rationalize. And there were many of those who would look towards the rise of Enlightenment and seek out a return to nature and pastoralism, where they can find themselves once again amongst the earth and the common people, looking upon the natural beauty of the world unchained by the constraints of society. For those of you who are wondering, yes, many of them were rich dudes that could afford to take expensive pilgrimages across Europe in order to see this natural beauty. Though, to give these guys a little bit of credit, many of these pilgrims would go on to create a lot of great artwork, placing much emphasis on the extremes of our emotional spectrum, embracing the subjectivity of our world through art. This was going on in pretty much every place within Europe, but we are going to be specifically zeroing in on the Sturm und Drang movement that was taking place in Germany, where it was common for many artists to journey throughout the German countryside and settle in the many small villages to find their inspiration. And it is here where we find a small town named Welzar, where our two key players emerge within our story, Johann and Karl. Wetzlar was a small town of about 4,000 that was primarily known for housing one of the Holy Roman Empire's Supreme Court buildings, the Reichskammer. Germany, I'm so sorry. Bless your pronunciation skills. But it was here that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem worked as doctors of law. Another lawyer, Johann Christian Kästner, recounted their arrival.
This spring, a certain Goethe came here. He is from Frankfurt, apparently a doctor of law, 23 years old, and the only son of a very wealthy father. He has come at his father's wish to look for a practice, but he himself inclines more to perusal of Homer, Pindar, etc., and whatever else his genius, his way of thinking, and his heart move him to.
Jerusalem had a similar upbringing. Born to a strongly religious family and attending the same college as Goethe, both of them had a similar love for classic poetry and painting, though there were certain things that would make the two of them different. While Jerusalem was found to be brooding and antisocial, Goethe integrated himself within the highest of society within Wetzlar by befriending people like Kästner. Goethe would later recall the disdain that Jerusalem seemed to have for him, but if there was one thing that made these two similar, is that they were both hopelessly in love with women that were already in committed relationships. Jerusalem found himself in love with a local countess named Elizabeth Hurd, and Goethe with a wealthy socialite named Charlotte Buff. Hurd was already engaged to a legation secretary, and Buff, coincidentally, had been in a courtship with Kästner since she was 15. Both of these men went on to react to this somewhat differently. Goethe remained good friends with both Charlotte and Kästner for the rest of his life, and Kästner did seem to have a pretty high opinion of him, despite the fact that Goethe was very unsubtle about his infatuation with Charlotte, with Kästner once writing,
I went to see my girl and found Dr. Goethe there. He loves her, and however much of a philosopher he is and however well disposed towards him, do not like to find him alone with my girl entertaining her.
Yeah, I bet he doesn't. Eventually, Charlotte spelt it out that the two of them were only going to remain friends, and Goethe would depart from Wetzlar immediately after. However, the three seemed to remain close enough as the years went on, though apparently not close enough to inform Werther that the two of them got married until after the ceremony. Jerusalem was given less sympathy. When he confessed his love to Elizabeth Hurd, after keeping him at an arm's length for quite some time, Hurd requested her husband that Jerusalem should be forbade from ever coming to the house again. and upon this rejection, Jerusalem spent the afternoon sorting out his affairs, and he asked if he could borrow 2 pistols for a trip that he was going to take from Kessner. And Kessner would go on to oblige. Now, some of you guys might already know where I'm going with this, so if these sort of topics are sensitive, skip here. But after drinking a glass of wine and sending his servants away, Jerusalem shot himself. But unfortunately, he didn't die immediately of his wounds. He laid there dying for the next 6 hours before being discovered by his servant in the morning, and it wasn't until the next day at noon that he finally passed. Like most who committed suicide at the time, Jerusalem would be immediately buried without any religious burial rites, and it was often customary for people to move on without even mentioning it. He was only 25 years old. Despite not being remotely close to Jerusalem, these events stuck with Goethe for the rest of his life. Considering how similar their situations were, it's not hard to imagine Goethe seeing the situation that happened with Jerusalem and wishing to process the emotions that are associated with his death. And it is from here where he began to write. Goethe's novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, would inspire a lot of insanity. Though, with the benefit of hindsight, it is interesting to see such displays of adoration for a book that might seem unremarkable by today's standards. The Sorrows of Young Werther is a prime example of the epistolary novel, which is a form of writing that is somewhat akin to a found footage movie today, asserting that the novel is a series of letters that were archived and cataloged the death of our titular Werther. However, understanding what we now know about Goethe and Jerusalem's life, there is an added level of nuance to this story that can help contextualize the reception it got. But enough beating around the bush. Let's get to summarizing. Our story begins with a young man named Werther writing to his dear friend Wilhelm. Werther has just turned 23 and has moved into a small town named Walheim after spending a bunch of time pining after an unknown girl, and vamoosing once she suddenly passed away. We never do get to find out what exactly happened between the two of them, but considering that this is the last time we really hear of her, there's probably a good chance that it wouldn't have worked out anyway. Though this is fine because Werther asserts that he's fully sworn off of love and those nerdy books of poetry that he became proficient in, so he can focus on basking the sublime beauty of the inn he has moved into and the surrounding fields and forest. The natural beauty of this place is so amazing that Werther's perplexed as to why the peasantry spends so much time worrying about stuff like working, buying and paying for food, and trying to make a living. In fact, Werther thinks that the most noble people that he has met so far are the children, since they are beings truly driven by our primal emotions, and aren't constrained by stupid things like societal expectations and responsibility. But he chalks us up to the lower classes being of simpler minds, which only helps to enhance the natural beauty of nature. Coincidentally, he's having a hard time making friends for some reason. Though this all changes when Werther befriends a guy with a full library with all the classics he could want. And to make things better, he also befriends the district judge, a respected man of society who lives outside of town with his 9 children. Some other people have also tried to make friends with Werther, but they can only be considered the most undesirable, so Werther tells them to piss off since he will only associate with the noblest of our society. So Werther is content with wandering through the surrounding nature, sketching the locals, and reading the books that he totally didn't swear that he was done with, when he is invited to a ball being held by that local judge. So he decides to accompany one of the local girls to his house alongside her aunt, who warns Werther to keep away from the judge's eldest daughter, since she is already engaged to a very noble suitor. Once at the party, he immediately becomes so utterly captivated with the daughter when she greets Werther and his date at the door. Classy! But Werther isn't just captivated. He is so utterly taken by the daughter that he is incapable of describing how and why she is so perfect. The woman's name is Charlotte, which should sound very familiar. She's fair and mild like most of the noble women of these stories, but most importantly, she's very graceful in how she takes care of the children and loves romance story. So Werther has a lovely time dancing with Charlotte at the ball as he swears that from now on, no one should waltz with her except me. At that point, another party guest mentions Charlotte's fiancé Albert, and oh yeah, she's already in a relationship, you dink! In spite of this, Werther is still taken to visit Charlotte's family almost every day, going on walks, playing with the kids, and hanging out with the locals. During one of these excursions, Werther and Lottie are conversing with the local preacher and his daughter Friederike, who is accompanied by Mr. Schmidt, a noble gentleman who offends Werther by being, gasp, ill-humored, which either meant that he has a short fuse or suffers from depression. It is at that point that Werther makes a speech declaring that one of the worst people out there are the invalids that aren't strong enough to face the harshness of our world, and maybe if they got more of that sweet nature they wouldn't be so gosh darn depressed. A speech that is so rousing that Werther swears that everyone but Schmidt was nearly moved to tears and clapped.
Yeah, I bet that's what happened.
It should be noted that we never get to read any of Wilhelm's responses, but Werther is insistent that Charlotte must love him, just by the way that she looks at him. That must be the only reason she likes having him around. Honest! So we can take some guesses as to how Wilhelm is reacting to all this. Werther resolves to spend a little less time with Charlotte, but finds himself visiting nearly every day. Though once he hears of Charlotte's fiancé Albert returning, he's happy to befriend him. Now, Albert is already a good-tempered scholar, but what really wins Werther over to him is how he doesn't kiss Charlotte whenever Werther is around. Truly, he is a kind and honorable gentleman. So Werther swears that he will no longer pine for Charlotte, but based on his increasingly violent outbursts and his habit of visiting Charlotte when Albert isn't around, it's not going great. But Werther resolves that things aren't as bad as they look, since he's still great friends with Charlotte and Albert. Such good friends that when Werther sees Albert's pistols, he immediately borrows one of them to joke about killing himself.
Yep, no warning signs here.
It is here that Albert discussed how immoral the act of suicide is, which Werther agrees with, though does assert that, similar to moral quandaries like stealing, there may be some times where it can be permitted, even comparing the act of suicide to the noble act of overthrowing a tyrant to a country, a statement that Albert vehemently disagrees with, partially on the basis that that comparison doesn't make any goddamn sense! As the weeks go on, it is clear that staying in Walheim is taking a toll on Werther, where even his books and the surrounding nature doesn't seem to help his mood. So Wilhelm takes it upon himself to get Werther a job with an ambassador, which will allow him to take some time away from Lottie and Albert. While away at his job, Werther befriends Count C, a well-educated man who hits it off with Werther, which causes the ambassador to become jealous of Werther's relationship with the Count, thinking that someone in the middle class like Werther shouldn't be surrounded by the high-ranking members of our society. And this is not the last time where Werther encounters such a conflict, as the other main person that Werther befriends is a young aristocrat named Miss von B. The two also hit it off, and she is a friendly, learned woman who just happens to look a lot like Charlotte. But everyone seems to look down upon Werther because of his class, constantly saying belittling and condescending things to him.
That sounds familiar!
While these classist sentiments don't do much to help Werther's love life, things take a turn when Werther writes back to Walheim to see how everyone is doing, only to find out that Albert and Charlotte got married without telling him. This is obviously a shock, as Werther had previously promised himself that he would take down a portrait of Charlotte that he had hanging over the mantel once the ceremony was over, but deems to keep it up since the two never officially told him about the ceremony. Eventually, the problems with Werther's job come to a head when the Count has a dinner party. The evening was going well when Miss B arrives with her family. As the two begin to take to talking, she slowly becomes unresponsive to Werther. As the evening goes on, the partygoers become increasingly passive-aggressive towards Werther until the Count apologetically suggests that Werther leave. Werther takes a moment to go outside, and upon returning is mocked by the entire party for sticking around. A few days later, Werther encountered Miss B in the street, where she exclaims her frustration that Werther didn't take the hint and leave when she didn't respond to him, since she knew how the other nobility would treat him. She then tearfully exclaimed how her aunt and her friends started spreading vicious rumors about her and Werther, and how she was unable to do anything to defend it. The final straw was given when these rumors even circulate to Werther's workplace, which results in him resigning. Luckily, one of the princes makes the acquaintance of Werther, and he departs for one of his country houses. On his way there, Werther stops by his home village, which briefly does make him feel better. But seeing how many parts of his village changed makes him feel depressed again. He seems to get along well enough with the prince, but he feels like he is only valued for his ability to work rather than who he is as a person, as he has this growing sense of directionlessness. He briefly considers joining the army, but the prince thinks that's a bad idea. Werther begins to feel more distance with the prince, and he resolves to depart for Walheim and Charlotte again, stating how he is too much of a wanderer to stay in one place. Though as he grows closer to Walheim, Werther becomes more and more delusional as he contemplates a life with Charlotte and how his sensibilities makes him a much better match to her than Albert. And by the time he gets to town, Werther is openly fantasizing about Albert dying and him being able to marry Charlotte, as he begins to rapidly more descend into this delusion. And eventually, Werther receives word that Albert is away on business as he returns to see Charlotte. Though as he sees how parts of the town have changed for the worst and his relationship with Charlotte hasn't improved, he does begin to explain how nothing brings him joy like it used to. As time goes on, Lottie and Wilhelm are increasingly concerned about Werther, who has now taken to drinking more. Werther blows off Wilhelm's suggestions of finding God, but Werther laments that there is no being that could dissuade him from turmoil. Outside of his fits of drinking and visiting Charlotte, two notable things happen to Werther in the coming letters. The first being an encounter with a lovesick man searching for wildflowers in the field, even though it's almost winter. When Werther tries to reason with him, the man's mother rushes on to explain that he had been recently released from an asylum and is still suffering from delusions. While Werther takes to pitying him, he can't help but long to similarly escape reality.
Cool.
The next is when Werther hears news that one of his acquaintances in town is being arrested for murder. The man is a farm boy who had earlier discussed his infatuation with the widow he was working for with Werther, which immediately endeared him to the farm boy. But once Werther had returned from his time with the ambassador, he found that the servant tried to rape his mistress and was promptly fired, only for him to later murder the servant that came to replace him. In finding this out, Werther goes to the courthouse to defend the servant, exclaiming how such crimes could be defended on the basis of being done out of the noble pursuit of love.
Yeah, crimes like murder and attempted rape.
As you can imagine, the judge doesn't accept that defense, and Werther is furious when he is told that there is nothing that can be done to save the murderer, and feels betrayed when Albert defends the judge, declaring this as further evidence for his unworthiness to be Charlotte's husband. Though upon seeing Werther defend a murderer and an attempted rapist, Albert understandably thinks that it would be best if they invited Werther over less. But the loss of the farm boy does take a toll on Werther. So much so that Wilhelm gives him an ultimatum for Werther to stay with him in order to help him. Werther agrees, but because of the harsh winter, he wants to delay his departure by 2 weeks so he can take a more scenic path in his travels. During that time, Lottie is trying to toe a fine line between distancing herself from Werther while not trying to be too cruel. She makes a proposal for Werther to visit on Christmas Eve and promises him a gift if he is able to stay away from the house until that day, stating how his everyday visits to the house cannot continue. Werther doesn't listen to this, since he believes that Albert is making her write this note. And it is from here that Werther resolves to commit suicide, since if one of the three had to go, it probably should be him. So he spends the day sorting out his affairs before going to Charlotte's house one last time. No present for you then, I guess. When he arrives at the house, Lottie is happy to see him, but is disappointed that he didn't respect her wishes, which she probably shouldn't be too surprised by at this point. The two are currently alone in the house, and things are a little awkward, to say the least. Charlotte tries to think of friends that she could pair Werther off with, but has a hard time thinking of anyone who's perfect enough for him. She then laments how she can't keep both Werther and Albert like she always wanted.
Mind you, this isn't information relayed by Charlotte,
but the book speculating on how she must have felt, which I'm sure totally isn't a biased portrayal of these events at all. Eventually, Charlotte suggests that Werther read from a translation of Ossian that he was working on. Werther obliges, but doesn't get too far before he breaks down and tearfully embraces Charlotte. The two share a tender moment, but it is all ruined when Werther tries to kiss her, which she immediately nopes out of this and tells Werther that she won't ever see him again and that he should probably leave before locking herself in her room. After spending the next hour waiting for one final goodbye, Werther finally leaves to finish off his suicide note, but not before spending much of the evening wandering on the mountainside in the middle of the freezing rain and snow. But once he gets back home, he spends the next day sleeping in and writing his notes, the two being another screed to Charlotte and Wilhelm about how they will meet again in the afterlife, the other a request to Albert to borrow some pistols for his upcoming journey. Albert, thinking that this was for his journey to Wilhelm, granted this request, and Werther then spends the next night drinking a single glass of wine, and informs his servant to leave early since they will be departing on his journey the following morning. That night, Werther uses the delivered pistols to shoot himself in the head. Though because these are 18th century pistols we're talking about, the shot doesn't prove fatal, and Werther then spends most of the night and most of the next day trying to end his suffering without any success while slowly bleeding out. And just like Jerusalem, it doesn't take until noon the next day for Werther to finally pass away, and he would be promptly buried in an unmarked grave later that day, with the story ending matter-of-factly with the statement, "Guildsmen bore the body, no priest attended him." Feel-good story of the century! While much of my recounting of this story was done with a great degree of snark, there is much about this story and Werther that I do find compelling. For one, there are many elements of Werther's character that feel so emblematic of how men are expected to act within that time period, as their antiquated understanding of how our brains work make them ill-equipped to address what many would nowadays prescribe as severe depression. And knowing that this was all based on the real-life experiences of Goethe and Jerusalem, it helps to bring out a believability that helps us to further identify with the battles that Jerusalem lost to, and Goethe continued to fight against. While I won't pretend to know what was going on in Goethe's head when he wrote this, there's much about this novel that has a sense of catharsis within its confessional style of writing. Though what makes me return to this story time and time again is just how utterly similar it seems to feel towards the problems that men generally face today, as our society moves past traditional expectations of gender. A lot of people now have come to compare Werther to modern movements like incels, as they similarly have toxic idealizations of relationships and embrace a sense of nihilism that has led to many within that movement to dying in one way or another. To me, the biggest tragedy of this story isn't the unrequited love of Charlotte, but Werther's inability to meaningfully address his depression, partially because of his disdain towards other people who seem to suffer from similar conditions, but also because he lived in a world where we weren't willing to properly help people like him. It is a tragedy that doesn't condone his shitty behavior, but one which provides us apt warning signs that can help us identify the ways to further prevent such tragedies from happening again. As you could imagine, the fans had a very different reading of this novel. Now, this is already going to go into some buck wild territory as it is, but something that I want you to keep in mind is that Goethe was only 24 years old when he wrote this book, taking the dramatic events of his lives and Jerusalem's and combining it into this single sordid tragedy. And as anyone who has read fanfiction based off of real-life people will tell you, others might go to some weird places in response to this kind of stuff. And Werther can be easily cited as one of the first major examples of this occurring. Goethe published this story anonymously in September of 1774. Upon its publication, the confessionary style of writing made it exceedingly popular with readers, with many reading these events as if they have occurred in real life, which makes sense since that's mostly the case. This resulted in the novel becoming one of the most widely traded and distributed novels throughout the world, as translated copies of the stories were appearing all throughout Europe, even as far as going to China, as it would become a sort of competition to different writers to get out their translations as soon as possible to meet demand. Part of the demand for this novel stemmed from the epistolary format, which made it especially easy to read aloud at social gatherings or by oneself, where one could easily spend an evening reading and discussing the events of the story. And because of the scandalous nature of the novel and its subject matter, it helped to greatly enhance its popularity. And the next 15 years following the novel's publication would be later titled Werther Fever, as it would come to resemble a lot of the staples of modern fandoms. During the initial years of its release, much of the reception was built upon that aforementioned discussions that were held throughout all of Europe, many of those discussions centering around the ambiguous elements to this story, including the responses to Werther's letters, whether or not Charlotte really loved him, and the ultimate fate of the other characters following Werther's death. As with any other story that has ambiguous elements that came since, many fans would take it upon themselves to fill in the blanks with their own fan creations. Painters would take to illustrating their favorite scenes from the novel, as well as many paintings depicting Charlotte visiting Werther's grave. Poems, songs, operas, and plays would be written retelling the different events of the story, and would be shared to include many of the perspectives of the different characters. And in each country that he was adapted in, it was quite popular to make it so that Werther came from that region. And in the case of the 1791 French adaptation, Werthery, a woman. Yes, even in the 18th century, people were writing gender-swapped AUs of their favorite stories. And people didn't stop at writing adaptations of these stories, oh no. Once it became common knowledge that Goethe was the author and the novel was based on real-life people, Wetzlar would soon become a destination for devotees of the novel. And a popular tourist guide titled The Handbooks for Travelers on the Continent gave detailed instructions on how to find Wetzlar, as well as the former homes of Goethe and Charlotte Buff, as well as the grave and dying place of Jerusalem, locations that people still visit to this day. Even outside of Wetzlar, some innkeepers would take advantage of some of these fan tourists by telling them that nearby mounds of dirt were the graves of Werther, as they would let travelers visit it for a small fee. A fee that many fans were more than happy to pay in order to do so. This would not be the only time that people tried to get rich off of this story. Once Werther fever hit all of Europe, you bet there was Werther merchandise. Porcelain dishes or figurines would join the many paintings depicting scenes from the book. Tailors would market gloves, coats, and hat as official Werther outfits so that fans can partake in some of the earliest examples of cosplay. And certain fans would even go the extra mile by buying the special Eau de Werther, so you too can smell like someone's tragic death. Fans of Werther would stretch far and wide, where everyone from Mary Shelley to Napoleon would sing their praises for the story. And those of you who are familiar with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you might remember that Werther was amongst the 3 books that the monster read in the story, the other 2 being Plutarch's Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans and Milton's Paradise Lost.
Besides the interest of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto been to me obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. I thought Werther himself a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sunk deep. As I read, however, I applied much personality to my own feeling and condition. I found myself similar to, yet at the same time strangely unlike the being concerning whom I read, and to whose conversations I was a listener.
My mention of Frankenstein is apt, since the monster loved the novel for many of the same reasons that other fans appreciated it. They related to the struggles that Werther underwent, and could see themselves in Werther's place whenever they were rejected by the world or the people they loved. And in hindsight, there are a lot of problems with that reading, but that reading was nevertheless the general consensus during Werther Fever. And with all of these retellings, merchandise, cosplay, and even pilgrimages that people were taking for the sake of the story, Werther would eventually encounter the inevitable obstacle for every fandom: the discourse. With the rising popularity of Werther Fever, a lot of people became concerned about the content of the novel, particularly members of the church, who decried the novel as suicide apologia, citing how the sympathetic portrayals of those who have lost their battle with suicide could result in the easily swayed youth following Werther and committing suicide themselves. Put a pin in that. As shocking as it might seem right now, the demonization of the novel was actually a very common practice, as it was considered a medium of storytelling that was considered less esteemed from the likes of poetry and theater, with many indulging in the romantic materials that would be considered scandalous and immoral, not too dissimilar to how certain people view the medium of fanfiction today, video games in the 1990s, and tabletop games in the 1970s. And just like those previous scares, a mythos began to emerge of people copying Werther as they committed suicide. To this day, when most people are discussing this novel, they will either cite its mention within Frankenstein or discuss the alleged suicide epidemic that followed its release, a phenomenon that was later called the Werther effect. I say allegedly, because many researchers have gone on to cite a large absence of evidence that these cases even occurred. One notable study being written by Jan Thorson and Per-Arne Öberg for the International Academy of Suicide Research. Granted, given the taboo nature of suicide in the 18th century and the vast amounts of information that can be lost in this amount of time, it does make it impossible to fully assert that this never happened. That said, there are a couple of deaths that many specifically blame on this novel as a cause, so it is fair to examine those. The first was a young woman named Fanny von Eichstätt, a noblewoman who was known for having large mood swings and was known for talking about death before falling in love with a military officer, though because he wasn't rich enough, the mother forbade the marriage, and Fanny would later fall from the towers of the Munich Freudenreich to her death. Now, there are a lot of things that we can point towards in this tragedy, from Fanny's controlling home life to a lack of support for her clear mental struggles, but because she allegedly happened to have a poem about Werther on her when she died, the city of Munich sensationalized the tragedy, calling Fanny the female Werther because of their similarities. The second most mentioned person is the case of Christina von Lasberg, a young woman who drowned in the river Ilm. None of my research could find anything about her life, her condition, or even if it was confirmed to be a suicide. What we do know is that the river was close by to where Goethe was staying at the time, and she happened to have a copy of Werther in her handbag when she died. Oh no, those are the only two. Yeah, there aren't any more. In all of my research about this book, there were only 2 deaths that were close enough to this book where one could charitably make the association between those two. And even then, there are plenty of more plausible reasons that one could use to make sense of these 2 tragedies. As for all of the other alleged cases, they were either second-hand accounts describing suicidal people reading the book, stories of crazed Werther fans traveling miles across Europe to kill themselves over the grave of a person that many people didn't know was actually fictional, to some people straight up blaming murders on the novel, even when there was clear evidence that none of the involved parties had even heard of the book. And even when these rumors were highly publicized, there were many that were skeptical of these sensationalized accounts and would speak out against the censoring of the novel. But one person who helped to perpetuate this scare was Goethe himself. Not even a year after the novel's publication, Goethe was already publicly burnt out on Werther fever. While the story suddenly helped to propel Goethe to worldwide fame, the nature of copyright and royalties at the time resulted in Goethe receiving very little financial success out of it. This, coupled with him being sandwiched in between fans speculating and inquiring about his personal life, and nobles that were decrying him as a corrupter of the youth, it makes it understandable why this might be the case. But once there were stories circulating around about the Werther effect, Goethe would publicly voice his regrets for publishing the novel after hearing that people might harm themselves because of it. Goethe would later describe Werther as a brother that he helped to bury, only for his vengeful ghost to follow him for the rest of his life, as it would be the main thing that he would be known for, despite his future accomplishments in the fields of science, politics, and literature. This condemnation greatly assisted advocates of censorship and the banning of novels throughout all of Europe, and cities like Leipzig and countries like Denmark would take to banning reprints and translations of the novel being sold.
Also, I just found this out and couldn't find a better place to put this in, but it is all but confirmed that Goethe absolutely had a foot fetish, as he was affectionately called Mr. Bigfoot by his wife Christine Vulpius, and she recalled a letter where he begged to have her dancing shoes sent to him so he could hold them to his heart. Yes, I am absolutely kink-shaming an 18th century author. Now you too are burdened with this knowledge.
The culmination of this drama would arguably occur when another German author by the name of Christoph Friedrich Nicolai published The Joys of Young Werther, a semi-satirical retelling of the story that offered an alternate ending.
In this version, Albert realizes Werther's intention when he asks to borrow the pistols, and at the moment, he decides to load the pistols, but not with bullets, but pellets filled with chicken blood. And when Werther fires the pistols, Albert rushes to find Werther in a pool of blood, as he exclaims his willingness to relinquish his claim to Charlotte as his wife, to which Werther promptly jumps for joy and proceeds to marry Charlotte. The two almost move into a modest retreat with an exotic garden before it immediately is washed away by a flood, which leads the two to happily assimilate into bland vanilla bourgeois life.
Feel-good story of the century? So that's kind of an underwhelming revision of the story, though consider that the story was based on real-life events and people that Goethe knew. You could imagine how he reacted when people started publishing revisionist versions of his story. In fact, Goethe was so pissed at Nicolai's retelling that he would summarize his feelings in a poem titled Nicolai at Werther's Grave.
A young person, I don't know how, died of hypochondria and was then buried. Then a beautiful ghost came by. He had his bowel movements free, how people have him. He sits down on the grave and takes off his clean house. Look at his filth with pleasure, breathing away again, and speaks carefully to himself. The good man, he takes me, how he's spoiled. If he had like me, he wouldn't have died.
So, to recap, Goethe, the author of The Sorrows of Young Werther, wrote a poem about a guy on the grave of Werther, a man based off of a real-life person, only for the guy to explain that if Werther made like him, he probably would still be alive. I don't know if I can add anything from here. Oh, God. It was Werther's original. I thought it was a prop. Anyway. So, there is a lot to unpack when it comes to discussing the Sorrows of Young Werther and the Werther fever that came to follow it. While it's clear to see how such a novel would go on to influence the Romantic literary movement, which went to subsequently define a majority of modern literature, it is striking to see how such fandom drama from the 1770s directly mirrors fandom drama that can be seen to this day. Today, we see a similar cycle where a work of art or a person will get popular, and fans will demonstrate their admiration through fan works and discussions. However, that ubiquity would eventually cause a backlash to arrive, as certain people decry that work and its fan as a symbol for society's downfall, resulting in increasingly toxic interactions between the fans and the creator of that work, usually culminating in messy public drama before people move on to the next big thing. You could easily swap Werther with any number of fandoms past and present, and this pattern will still emerge. Now, you might wonder what the point of all of this observation is. Why spend so much time discussing this old novel and painting this dour picture of fandoms? Well, in recounting this story, I'm reminded of a saying that one of my literature professors would always tell us. People have been doing the same stuff for as long as we have been people. Whenever any sort of drama emerges on the internet, many will be quick to condemn the drama as a wholly unique sensation within that fandom, where that fandom will be treated as this novel aberration that suddenly emerged to shove their toxicity down our throats. But if this novel is anything to go by, this sort of drama is not as unique as some would want you to think, and treating it as such only helps to perpetuate the conditions and problems that such fandom drama is symptomatic of. For Werther, the problems laid with strict class divides and a lack of understanding for mental health, rather than this nebulous idea of the Werther effect. And today, most of our problems with fandoms don't start or end with a particularly toxic fandom or an individual, but are the result of how we structure the ways we communicate and moderate the ideas that we share online. Though that might be another video for another day. But until next time, whenever you encounter something that you might feel passionate about, think about the ways that this passion can be used for good or for bad. For just as easily something can bring joy, it can also produce many sorrows. Thank you for watching. Best wishes.